I chose to focus on the interventions that were the most relatable to my future. All three of the interventions I will be speaking about were conducted in science classrooms and about science material. The first intervention I chose to focus on is using graphic organizers to teach science. Graphic organizers are visual or spatial displays that show relationships between facts and concepts. The goal of this study was to teach students science and photosynthesis area vocabulary using a graphic organizer. The teacher would print out a copy of the graphic organizer that already had the terms that the students were learning. To begin, the teacher would point to a different term on the graphic organizer and the class would define those terms and concepts. After this, each student would go through and figure out how the different terms and concepts were connected. They would put a plus sign to represent a positive relationship, a minus sign to display a negative relationship, and a 0 if there was no relationship. Then the entire class would come together to go over the worksheet with the teacher. This study was evidence-based. The first study was done on 3 experiment groups. 130 participants with disabilities were randomly assigned. The second study was done on 2 experiment groups and 6 single-study experiments on 6 participants with learning disabilities. It was implemented with students with learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disorder. There were 3 studies done with 130 participants with learning disabilities, 1 with 3 participants with autism spectrum disorder, and 1 study with 3 participants with ASD and an intellectual disorder. The students were ages 11 through 18 years old. There were 84 males, 44 females, and 8 not reported. There were 8 African American students, 4 American Indian students, 8 Asian students, 42 Hispanic students, and 66 other students, and 8 did not report. This intervention was implemented in 3 general education classrooms and 2 resource classrooms, and the subject area was science. To conduct this intervention, you would need a semantic feature analysis graphic organizer labeled with important vocabulary words and important ideas for each student. You would also need a large group display for group discussion like a screen or a whiteboard. Here are a few of the challenges that I thought about. I would have to print out multiple graphic organizers to give each student, so I would need to make sure that I had the resources to do so. To overcome this challenge, the students could also work in groups to complete the graphic organizer so that less paper would have to be used. Graphic organizers combine multiple concepts, so it would be a challenge for every student to know every single concept, but also how they relate to each other. It would be important for me to not jump straight into this activity, but to have a good base knowledge of what concepts are as to not overwhelm my classroom. The second intervention I chose to talk about is using mnemonics to teach science content. Mnemonic instruction has been defined as a device, procedure, or operation that is used to improve memory. The goal of this study was to use mnemonics to learn definitions of science terms. The mnemonic device was IT FITS, which stands for identify the term, tell the definition of the term, find a keyword, imagine the definition doing something with the keyword, think about the definition doing something with the keyword, study what you imagine until you know the definition. This was the way the teacher was teaching the students to learn to study for scientific terms, like biome. The study was evidence-based. The first study was done on 6 experiment groups. 329 participants with disabilities were randomly assigned. The second study was done on 6 experiment groups. 322 participants with learning disabilities were randomly assigned. It was implemented with students with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disabilities. There were 6 studies done with 322 participants with learning disabilities, and 1 study done with 7 participants with emotional behavioral disabilities. The students were aged 11 to 16 years old. There were 246 males and 83 females. There were 166 white students, 8 African American students, 10 Hispanic students, 5 Native American students, and 123 not reported. This intervention was implemented in 2 general education classrooms, 3 special education classrooms, and 1 learning disability learning center, and the subject area was science. To conduct this intervention, you need a lot of materials. You need 8 by 11 inch note cards with keyword, vocabulary word, definition, and interactive illustration of that keyword and term, a teacher script, daily quizzes with 12 targeted terms, weekly tests with 48 words, 5 by 8 inch cards with vocabulary word on one side and keyword on the other, 3x5 index card to make personal set of vocabulary words, and a poster of the It Fits strategy steps. This intervention obviously requires a lot of material, so depending on the resources I have, it will be difficult to implement for every student. To overcome this challenge, I could make this a group activity as opposed to an individual activity. The third and final intervention I chose to talk about is using peer tutoring to teach science. Peer tutoring or peer-mediated instruction has been defined as having students of the same age tutor each other or work together as partners or in small groups to complete assignments. The goal of this study was to teach students to respond correctly to 6th grade science questions across 3 units on the following topics: technology and energy, kinetic and potential energy, and continents and tectonic plates, as well as the KWHL chart using inclusive inquiry science lessons through using peer tutoring. Teachers would train peers in tutoring and then allow them to tutor students not as confident in their skills during class. This study was evidence-based. The first study was done on 2 groups. 106 participants with disabilities were randomly assigned. The second study was done on 1 group with 5 participants with disabilities in an individual study. The third group was done on 2 groups. 70 participants with learning disabilities were randomly assigned. It was implemented with students with learning disabilities, intellectually disabled, moderately disabilities, emotional behavioral disorders, autism, multiple disabilities, speech and language disorder, other health impairment, LD and EBD, LD and OHI, served under Section 504, language learners, and then students without disabilities. There were 70 participants with learning disability, 5 students that were moderately intellectually disabled, 7 students with emotional behavioral disorders, 6 students with autism, 2 students with multiple disabilities, 1 student with a speech and language disorder, 2 students with other health impairments, 2 students with a learning disability and emotional behavioral disability, 13 students with learning disability and an other health impairment, 3 students served under Section 504, 35 English language learners, and 134 students without disabilities. The students were ages 11 to 14 years old. There were 151 males and 129 females. There were 143 white students, 64 African American students, 42 Hispanic students, 10 Asian students, 16 multiracial students, and 5 not reported. The intervention was implemented in 3 general education classrooms, and the subject area was science. To conduct this intervention, you would need a PowerPoint for a peer training session, a checklist for peers to self-monitor their trials, and sample materials for the peer training session. The biggest challenge would be making sure that the peer tutors are knowledgeable and responsible. It would be important that I take the time to choose the students that are most inclusive and actually want to tutor other students. Once I have chosen the students, another challenge would be monitoring the tutors. The checklist is very helpful, and I would walk around the classroom while the peer tutoring is happening so I can make sure that everything is running smoothly.